guys, thank you so much for joining me for part 2. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, definitely go back and listen to it because this part is probably not going to make too much sense, at least the beginning of what I'm going to be talking about, because I'm continuing on from last episode. Thank you. Where I left off was with Jesse Misskelley with the West Memphis 3 trials. And they were interrogating him, as I said. You know, he took the polygraph. They said he was lying his ass off, even though he only failed one question. And that was if he smoked marijuana, which all teens lie about that dabble in that, I guess. That's kind of silly. But yeah, he passed all the questions asking him if he was involved, if he knew he was involved. You know, it was really awful. They set him up, essentially. So after interrogating him for hours and hours on end, he was exhausted. He was probably hungry because they can withhold food from you for a certain amount of time. And they finally got him to confess the whole story and implicating himself, Damien Echols, and Jason Baldwin. And he kind of made his part in it a little bit less. But they definitely recorded the only part where they didn't have to feed him any information and he told the story from beginning to finish. So after that, of course, they arrest everybody. They basically SWAT team down Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin's homes and take them in and put them in jail and wait for the trial, even though they all say that they're innocent the entire time. Even Jesse Misskelley said that he was innocent after confessing. He said that they got it out of me. They tricked me. They told me I would get to go home if I would just give them what they wanted, which unfortunately is the case in a lot of criminal interrogations. I do believe we've gotten better since back then, but it was awful back then, and I believe it does still go on to an extent today. So they enter their plea August 4th, and of course they all plead not guilty. And then the following February, Jesse Misskelley has his trial, and they convict him with all ridiculously circumstantial evidence. Not even, physical circumstantial evidence. It's mostly done on hearsay, which is, kids in the neighborhood saying, oh yeah, he's weird. I saw him do this and I saw him do that. But it was all just a bunch of the town going crazy with these kids that didn't do anything wrong. They were just weird. They didn't really work too hard on Misskelley's case because they had his taped confession, and the defense didn't do a very good job representing him, so it was pretty much, he's guilty. He got life without the possibility of parole. And then after Misskelley's case, the case with Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, they were tried together as a team, and their defense team they tried, but they didn't do the greatest job. The state had witnesses that were supposed to be experts. However, they had somebody who was supposed to be a cult expert who ended up getting his certificate, quote unquote, from a mail order school where you send them $20 and they send you something with your name on it saying that you have a degree in such and such specialty. The problem is, well, there's a lot of problems with this whole situation, but the problem is that these boys were indicated, mostly Damien Echols, and there had to be other people that went down with him. He was known around town, and the authorities basically, instead of building a case based on evidence, they built a case based on the people they wanted, and they tried to build the evidence around them, which is really very dangerous when they do it that way at times. Because of all this, because of all the evidence that they believe to be true about these boys, about how especially Damien is a devil worshiper, he is the leader of the group, and he put this all together to kill these 3 young boys as a sacrifice to Satan. And they went as far as to checking his library book history, and he did check out some Wiccan books, and they took those to be evil and satanic, even though they aren't. It's a completely different thing. When all was said and done, even though the case was very weak against these boys, they were convicted of first-degree murder, and Damien was sentenced to death by lethal injection, and Jason Baldwin was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. As the years go by, a whole bunch of attention is brought to this case because, the appeals are being filed and people are noticing and actually looking into this whole crime that happened, that the wrong people were convicted of, but they are in prison where they don't belong. And a lot of people, including celebrities, start rallying for them to be released and paying for their evidence to be retested, because honestly, the evidence wasn't tested well. DNA really wasn't a thing, and there was a lot of evidence left that could be retested, but the state of Arkansas was giving such a hard time because, as you know, a lot of times, even though there's significant evidence that a court goofed up, they will not want to admit it at all. They will hold strong on their initial verdict, and that is very unfortunate. These boys, now men, they're in their 20s now, start getting the attention of celebrities like Johnny Depp, singers from Metallica, even the Dixie Chicks, the country group, get into this whole thing and start to get rallies on to free them and try to raise money to get a better defense for them. Every time they appeal to have a new trial, Judge Barnett, who was on the first case, denies it every single time. He refuses flat out to see this again because he felt he made the right choice. Unfortunately, I honestly feel that even though they might have known they messed up, they don't want to admit to it and they don't want to look bad. We fast forward all the way to 2011, and they're putting pressure on the courts in Arkansas because there's so many people that are backing this up, so much money that's being raised, so much outrage about how disappointing this is, that such a miscarriage of justice was handed down simply because these boys were just the different kids in town. They were goth, they were just, they thought they were Satan worshipers just by the way they looked and acted. And that's just awful to all these celebrities because many of these celebrities were the same way when they were younger. So they kept asking for a new trial. The trial was denied. And they were looking into it, that there was a lot of jury misconduct. So the state comes back and they offer the men something called an Alford plea. And the Alford plea basically is a plea where you plead guilty but maintain your innocence. You plead guilty because you admit that the state may have enough evidence that will convict you, but you're still saying, I didn't do it, but I'm going to plead guilty because they might convict me again if I don't, based on possible evidence. They all had to agree to this, and Baldwin was holding out a little bit, but they finally convinced him because Damien was in very bad shape in prison. He was on death row, so he got no medical care. He was in the dark all the time, and he was just deteriorating. Like he was almost wishing for death at that point until this little beacon of light happened. Finally, they all agreed to it, and they all plea to the Alford plea, and they are released the day they plea because they were let go based on time served. Today, these men are actually activists. Jesse Miskelly Jr. lays low, still lives in the West Memphis area. I believe he takes care of his dad, who is elderly now. But Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin are activists in wrongful convictions. And Jason Baldwin, I believe, actually, he can't be an attorney because he's still a felon because of the guilty plea, but he works with attorneys. He's an activist for this cause. And then Damien Echols, he's still trying to get their name cleared because they're trying to get evidence tested, and they're having a tough time doing that even today. It's still actually pretty current. You can look up some news stories and see that Arkansas is still fighting them to get this stuff tested because it's instead of, admitting that they were wrong, they're going to stand strong with this verdict. Honestly, to me, the biggest tragedy, other than these three people being wrongfully convicted and spending all this time in prison is the fact that these three sweet, innocent boys will never have their killer convicted if this keeps going on. They can't look for another person unless these three guys get exonerated. I mean, they really don't care at all. They're like, we have our verdict, we have the right guys. Why should we do anything different? And this all basically stemmed from the Satanic Panic. Everybody got in uproar and assumed this awful crime was probably done by Satan worshippers and just picked out who they thought was the weirdest. A very religious community basically held its own version of the Salem witch trials and tried to hang the perpetrators. Thankfully, they couldn't, but if it were in that era, they probably would have been hung without any questions asked. So that kind of wraps up my section on the Satanic Panic. Some people who've claimed to kill for Satan and some other miscarriages of justice caused by the mass hysteria. Next, I'm going to discuss the case of Lori Vallow Daybell and the intense beliefs that her and her new husband have adopted along with some of their followers, which seems pretty culty. I don't know if they've ever officially called it a cult. It's kind of a small operation. However, the things they did and believed and the extreme measures they took could very well be considered cult-like activity. For all intents and purposes, Lori Vallow Daybell was the perfect mom. She had an older son from her second marriage, a young girl from her third marriage, and her fourth husband and her adopted her husband's nephew's son, JJ. So there was Colby first, Tylee was her daughter, and JJ, Joshua Jackson, was their adopted son, which apparently she was the greatest mother ever. JJ had special needs and needed some extra attention, and she gave it to him. Like everything he ever needed, she took care of, along with his adopted dad, Charles. They appeared to be the perfect family. They went on vacations to Hawaii. They actually ended up living in Hawaii for a little bit. The kids did well. They were very intelligent. They were thriving. JJ, with his special needs, was absolutely thriving in a special school he was going to for children with autism. He even had a service dog that was his best friend. Lori, in her former days, was a hairstylist, but because of Charles having such a great job, he made enough money for her to be able to stay home. He did travel quite a bit for his job, but he was able to spend as much time with the family as he possibly could. I mean, he could afford it. They had a beautiful home, and they basically lived the life of luxury. Lori was always a devout Latter-day Saint, or what we call Mormons as well, and she was very devoted to her religion. She loved going to temples. She followed the scripture. It was wonderful for her. But she was also kind of getting extreme in her beliefs. She started going to different conferences called Preparing a People, where it's basically doomsday preppers. They're expecting the second coming to come very soon, and they are getting everybody ready that believes, by stocking up on food and getting resources together, making plans, and that's all fine. If you want to do that, if you want to can food, if you want to get tents, if you want to, get a community together, that's fine. As long as you're not hurting anybody, you just do you, right? Whatever you feel like is going to get you to the afterlife and favor, to a great heaven. People began noticing a change in Lori around 2017, where she started reading books of an author named Chad Daybell. He also spoke at different conferences for these Preparing a People, and he wrote books on near-death experiences and was kind of obsessed with it. He sold his books as fiction, but only because they wouldn't sell well as nonfiction, because when it comes to religious beliefs, sometimes they have to go as fiction because they won't sell quite as well. So according to her family, Lori starts kind of obsessing over these books and over, the idea of doomsday prepping. She's getting intensely into it and kind of getting a little into Chad Daybell. At this time, they hadn't met yet, but she went to a conference in 2018, October of 2018, and they finally meet for the first time. And it was a religious conference in Utah, and they apparently just fall in love with each other. Chad woos her by saying that she's a goddess. They were married in past lives. They were so in love. They were been married 5 times in the past life dimensions. Unfortunately, this is where it really starts becoming an offshoot of Mormonism. Latter-day Saints do not believe in past lives, and this really goes against their belief system. They also don't give a date for the second coming. They just know that they have to do their best to be ready for it by living good lives and praying and just doing what they're supposed to be doing as far as the Mormon Book of Mormon tells them to do. As this goes on, they're communicating constantly, sending each other lovey-dovey texts, falling in love with each other. Lori is this exalted goddess who has done everything she has to do on earth to where she's no longer mortal, and she's in charge of what they believe is 144,000 people that will live through the second coming of Christ. All the other people are going to die in wars and fire. 144,000 will be led by her and Chad to basically paradise. Their practices and beliefs are really going rogue. Lori's behavior really starts turning against Charles, her husband. Up until she met Chad, they were a great couple. As far as everybody could tell, they were very much in love. They had a great partnership. And around February 2019, Charles files for divorce. And he is fearing for his life because Lori is saying awful things to him. Basically, he's scared for the safety of himself and his children. She's threatening to kill him, and nobody would know about it. And she believed that she was preparing for a second coming. So she believed that killing him wouldn't be a big deal because Christ is coming back anyway. She did have a mental health intervention, and she was deemed competent. She just talked her way out of it. She was a very beautiful woman. For all intents and purposes, she was gorgeous, and she was very charismatic, and she could talk herself out of anything. So pressure was building up. And Lori had a brother named Alex Cox, and he was very much involved with her once she met Chad. They talked, but they weren't super close. But once she started having these beliefs, Alex started coming around more. Even moved from Arizona to Idaho with her at a later time. But he followed Lori wherever he went. He believed that he was supposed to be his protector. He fed into these beliefs just as much as she did. And even though Charles begged authorities to do something about his wife, he was scared. He needed her to be seriously evaluated because he warned them, she's going to try to talk herself out of it. She's charming. And they basically did nothing for him. The morning of July 11th in 2019, Charles came by to get JJ, the young boy, to take him to school. And there was some kind of altercation, and Alex, Lori's brother, was at the house at the time, and they got into an argument, and Alex shot Charles and killed him. It was really suspicious. He said it was self-defense, and Lori had ran off with the kids and took him to school, before this shot ever happened, supposedly. And Alex called 911. It turned out he called 911 about 45 minutes after Charles was actually shot. when Alex called 911, they instructed him to do CPR because he had told them it had only been a couple minutes since he shot Charles, but as we now know via the evidence, it had been 45 minutes. So at first he's like, well, I don't know how to do CPR. And of course the 911 dispatcher, as they are trained to do, they try to walk you through it. So Alex fakes doing CPR, like he's kind of huffing and puffing a little bit, but evidence will show that he didn't actually do CPR. Like, this was supposed to be like this. They wanted Charles dead. So they did nothing to save him. They made sure he was good and cold before they called 911. So Alex gets away with it because self-defense. They really didn't investigate it too deeply. It all looked fine and dandy to them. He claims Charles hit him in the head with a baseball bat. He had a little scratch on his head, which Charles was a former semi-pro baseball player. So if he hit him with a baseball bat, I highly doubt it would only leave a little scratch. So this all happened in Arizona, and right after this happened, they moved to Rexburg, Idaho, and this is where the second coming is supposed to be, kind of the central location of the safe haven for all the 144,000. And this just happens to be right around where Chad lives. Chad lived in a little outskirts area of Rexburg it's called Salem. And guys, there are so many details that I'm just going over. I more want to get the sequence in and their belief system, but we got to kind of build up on that just a little bit before we get to that part. So basically, Charles had to die because Lori believed, and Chad too, believed that there was a zombie that had taken over his soul. They call this going dark. Going dark means that you have signed a contract with the devil rather than God. Chad even has quite a system with the light and dark scales. Somebody can start out light and go dark. They can even start out dark and go to light. It depends what's happening with their soul at that moment in time. Basically, for this whole thing, everybody who was in their way, such as former spouses and children, if they didn't want them to be around and they kind of got in the way of their happy love life, they were basically going to be deemed dark. Now that Charles was gone and Lori had moved close to Chad, Chad's wife was still alive, whom he had 5 children with. Her name was Tammy Daybell. They had been married for around 30 years, had grandchildren together. For all intents and purposes, they seemed like a happy couple. I mean, they were quiet and standoffish because, their culture sometimes you're quiet and humble. But everybody said they were, loving parents. She was a very loving and attentive mother and librarian at the local school. So Chad and Lori started beginning their plans on how they were going to eliminate Tammy because her spirit was starting to go dark. And whenever they would deem somebody dark, the zombie or evil spirit that would enter them would have a name. Charles, it was Ned, or Iplos. He had a couple different ones. And for Tammy, it was Viola.